Good afternoon and a warm welcome to today's online Llafur event. I'm Ian Rees, Chair of Llafur, the Welsh People's History Society. Thank you for joining us today. This afternoon's session is the last in Llafur's Spring Series on migration in Wales. As most of you will by now be aware, we're dedicating the series to the memory of Llafur President Hywel Francis, who died in February, and of course who is greatly missed. Before we get underway, one minor housekeeping issue. Can I just remind you all once again to ensure your microphones are turned off during today's event? Thank you. One other reminder before we start, Llafur has recently launched a new essay competition, the Ieuan Gwynedd Jones Essay Prize. And we would very much like to encourage you to enter if you are an unpublished historian. Full details of the competition can be found on the Llafur website, so please check these out and consider submitting an entry by the end of June. Okay, on to today's session. Following on from last week's event on the Atlantic abolitionist movement of Wales, our theme for this afternoon is Untangling Empire and Identity. Through personal voyages of transnational discovery and through the re-examination of lived experiences and family memories, a body of writing and filmmaking has begun to develop which untangles our understanding of imperialism and racism and their relationship to Wales. Here to discuss their own individual journeys and the implications of their own autobiographical work for how we look at Wales, past, present and future, we're delighted to welcome three new guest speakers this afternoon: Hazel Carby, Charlotte Williams and Branwen Okpako. To introduce them and to chair today's discussion, we have Daniel Williams. Welcome, Daniel. Daniel was a guest speaker at last week's Llafur event where he gave an excellent talk, but this week takes over chairing duties. He is Professor of English Literature and Director of the Richard Burton Centre for the Study of Wales at Swansea University. He is also co-director of CREW, which is the Centre for Research into the English Literature and Language of Wales. Daniel is also the author of a number of books related to today's theme, including Ethnicity and Cultural Authority, Black Skin, Blue Books, and Wales Unchained. This year also sees the publication of a new edition of Daniel's collection of Raymond Williams' writings entitled Who Speaks for Wales? Nation, Culture, Identity, which is being released to mark the centenary this year of Raymond Williams' birth. Daniel, many thanks for chairing today's event. Over to you.
Thank you, Ian. Diolch yn fawr. It's obviously an honour to be chairing today at the end of a magnificent series, really, on migration in Wales. Croeso cynnes I bawb prynawn yma. Wy'n hynod o falch o fod yn gallu cadeirio fel hyn. The last correspondence I had with Hywel Francis was actually in relation to Professor Hazel Carby's Burton lecture, which she delivered at Swansea University over Zoom, of course, shortly before Christmas. Hywel phoned up, excited and inspired by Hazel's talk and her discussion of Paul Robeson in particular at the end, when we were having a conversation. So it's fitting that the series dedicated to Hywel should end with Professor Carby joining us, along with Branwen Okpako and Charlotte Williams. The title of today's session is Untangling Empire and Identity, though I think we might actually be engaged in tangling them up some more. I ended my meditations last week thinking about Wales and the whole debate about locating Wales within post-colonial studies. And I ended by quoting Professor Charlotte Williams. My point was that the nature and terms of the colonial debate is transformed once Wales itself is defined in multicultural terms as a crucible of difference in its own right, as opposed to the Welsh being one racial group contributing to the British melting pot. In her celebrated autobiography, Sugar and Slate, Charlotte Williams explores the problems inherent in comparing Welsh and Black, her terms. For when the Welshman is assumed to be a Black man at heart, she asks, where does that place the Black man who is Welsh or the Welshman who is Black? So are we all really comrades under the skin, she asks. It's a curious thought, I quote, perhaps we are in many ways. Paul Robeson in the film The Proud Valley isn't a Welsh folk hero for nothing. It's a sort of civil rights film for Wales. Yet maybe we have woven the connection rather too deep into the mythology of Wales. So today that mythology comes up against the material reality of lived experience and history. Definitions of migration, exile, belonging, ancestry, kinship, nationhood come into play and dialogue in the works of our three guests. I'll introduce all three now before we listen to their papers, and then we'll follow that with a conversation using the chat box that I'll try and keep up with as the conversation proceeds. So Professor Charlotte Williams will go first and is zooming in from Adelaide, Australia, I believe. She's honorary professor in the School of History, Philosophy and Social Sciences at Bangor University and holds honorary appointment at Glyndŵr University and the University of South Wales. Many of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with Charlotte's research and publications. She's published extensively on migration, on race, ethnicity, on multiculturalism, with particular reference to professional practice. She's co-editor of the groundbreaking text, Tolerant Nation, which I'm sure lots of you are familiar with. I lose my visual aids at this point. This is the second edition. And her most recent publication is the third edition of Social Policy for Social Welfare Practice in Wales. Charlotte's contributions to post-colonial studies include her memoir, Sugar and Slate, exploring her Welsh Guyanese heritage and diasporic identity, which was awarded the Welsh Book of the Year in 2003. And she's held several public appointments in Wales, most recently being appointed by the Minister for Education to chair the working group Communities, Contributions and Cynefin, Black Asian Minority Ethnicities in the New Curriculum, which reported in March of this year, and is a striking contrast to the Sewell report. Professor Hazel Carby comes to us from New Haven, from Connecticut, and is the Charles C. and Dorothea S. Dilley Professor Emeritus of African American Studies and Professor Emeritus of American Studies at Yale University, and a Fellow of the Royal Society for the Arts. She's currently a visiting research professor at the Humanities Institute faculty at Dartmouth College. Let me reach for my collected works of Hazel Carby. So Imperial Intimacies is the most recent book, a history of the British Empire told through one woman's search through generations of family stories. It moves, I'm sure many of you know this by now, between Jamaican plantations, the countryside of Devon, the port cities of Bristol and Kingston, and the working class estates of South London. But Cardiff, Pontyclun, and Wales also play a not insignificant part in this story. Hazel is also the author of a series of essays, Cultures in Babylon, Black Britain and African America, Race, Men, and Reconstructing Womanhood, the emergence of the African American woman novelist. She's also a co-author of The Empire Strikes Back, Race and Racism in 70s Britain, and I couldn't find my copy of that this week. I had reason actually to go into work this week, and the door of my office was actually locked and it said entry prohibited. So I'm not quite sure what's going on there. So I had to break through the university rules to get at these books. Finally, Branwen Okpako was born in Lagos, Nigeria. She received a BSc in Political Sciences from Bristol University in 1991, followed by MFA equivalent in film directing from the German Film and Television Academy in Berlin in 1999. Her graduation film, Dreckfresser, Dirt for Dinner, won several international awards. The fiction feature, Valley of the Innocent, had its world premiere at the Toronto International Film Festival in 2003, and her documentary film, The Education of Auma Obama, won the 2012 African Movie Academy Award for Best Diaspora Documentary, the Festival Founders Award for Best Documentary, and the Pan-African Film Festival in Los Angeles, and several other awards as well. Some of you might be familiar with Auma Obama. She's actually the most fascinating figure in Barack Obama's autobiography. A documentary drama, The Curse of Medea, about the life of the late German writer Christa Wolf, premiered at the Berlin International Film Festival in 2014. And then there's the short film Searching for Taid, a very moving film, which is a meditation on Wales, on ancestry, on kinship, on racial prejudice, and on much else. Branwen Okpako is Associate Professor at UC Davis in the Department of Cinema and Digital Media, and is currently completing her 6th feature film entitled Chibok Girls, based on the 2016 book of the same title by Helen Habila. So that's our 3 contributors today. It's great to have you with us, and we're all looking forward immensely to listen to your papers. So first up is Charlotte Williams. So I'll pass over the reins to Charlotte now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel. That's great. And I'm really delighted to be in this lineup with Hazel and Branwen. Welcome home, Branwen and Hazel. We are linked by our 3 Welsh mothers. So it's really fabulous that Llafur have made this connection transatlantic and across the Indian Ocean, as we are all located. Well, I want to do 3 things in my short talk. I'd first like to locate this genre of utilising the Black personal story in historiography. I find that quite difficult. Then I want to talk a little bit about Sugar and Slate and say something about my ambitions in writing it, including the observations that have been made by others who've written about it. And then finally like to conclude with some comments about how these intimate interrelationships reflect with wider issues of colonialism and empire, and perhaps along the way pose a few provocative questions. Well, of course, this personal story has a long legacy. This form of critical engagement for political action, its significance lies in its ability to highlight social injustices, to rework and reformulate realities, and to demonstrate agencies. Using these narrative projections, we actively renegotiate the dominant discourse of the other and construct hidden, dismissed, or discarded knowledges and histories. And this type of political action has a long history. Some examples are Sajida Truth, Ain't I a Woman? The poems of Phyllis Wheatley, which I particularly like, and of course, the slave narrative. And we have our own closer to home slave narrative of William Hall, the personal narrative of the sufferings and escape of William Hall, fugitive slave, now resident in the town of Cardiff, 1862. So these narratives enable us to change cultural meanings and understandings, but not only is the story itself significant, but as I hope to demonstrate, the moment and the mode of storytelling, the presentation of the text itself by the author as an intervention. One of the first questions we must ask is, why use autobiography? What's the relationship between our subjective experiences, our personal memory bank, and how those memories reflect a collective experience, such that we become representative something? I believe the use of autobiography has served to demonstrate myself as an embodied and located entity, and that through the writing of self comes a partial negation of the individual in the process of contextual immersion. Taking the idea of Raymond Williams's traceable identities. As I indicated, our attempts to write ourselves into being become exemplified by that very slave narrative I pointed to. Louis Gates Jr. points out that simply by publishing autobiographies, these become an indictment of the received order of Western culture. And he says, I quote, accused of lacking a formal and collective history, Blacks published individual histories which, taken together, were intended to narrate in segments the larger yet fragmented history of Blacks in Africa, now dispersed throughout the cold New World. And he suggests the narrated descriptive I, EYE, was put into the service as a literary form to posit both the individual I of the Black author and the collective I of race. So this tells us there's a certain purpose in telling these personal stories. They are not simply an exercise in individuation, but clearly aimed at illustrating a collective predicament. More latterly, these self-stories have been encapsulated in social science as a research methodology, autoethnography, as a way of building knowledge. So what's the significance of this knowledge? Well, Neil Evans, in his recent Llafur article, How White Was My Valley, has pointed to the significance of these accounts to the historiography of Wales. In his overview of the development of work on immigrants and minorities in modern Welsh historiography, he draws out the idea of history from below. And I quote him, traveling by foot rather than by car, or by air, gives a different perspective, a micro-cosmopolitanism as opposed to a macro-cosmopolitanism. Of course, these stories and this form of history making are not without contention. Ulrika Perker asks, does the subject belong to history or vice versa? Perhaps we should understand these individual acts of positioning as creative interventions into the wider dialectic, the relationship between self and historical meaning, reflecting moments of racialized time in particular contexts, in particular ways. So my opening point is about purpose, it's about perspective, and it's about questioning the role of these stories in history. So what about Sugar and Slate? Well, Sugar and Slate was to be an essay on Wales and its forgetting, its silences, and a challenge to the ideas of what it is to be Welsh. As an opener, and thank you to Marion Glynn for the title of the book, I draw on two commodities of my dual heritage in trying to suggest ways in which these were both commodities of types of colonialism: internal colonialism, that is the annexing of Wales, and the broader colonial enterprise of empire, representing my mum's country and my dad's country. On one level, my quest was to speak to Wales about a particular experience that I felt was missing from the literature, an experience that was not being culturally reproduced through the literature. Sarah Ahmed deliberates on this dilemma of individuation when she asks, under what conditions does the autobiographical gesture become possible and desirable, and how to perform that gesture without being implicated in a discourse of authenticity. My rather unique positioning, it's not so unique anymore, but at the time, not living in Cardiff, concerned me that my writing of self would become an exercise in individuation and serve to further disconnect me from the context of wider social and political forces. I wondered if, by demonstration of my individual difference and disidentifications, I would implicate myself so wholly as to deny the possibility of a collective address. So I used the idea of not identities. Homi Bhabha calls them negated identities. Not white, not black, not African, not European, not English, not quite Welsh, not Guyanese, not belonging, not home, and of course, definitely not a poet. I quote, "The Africa thing hung about me like the Welsh knot, a heavy encumbrance on my soul, a not identity, an awkward reminder of what I was or what I wasn't." Such a denial of authentic identity proposes some kind of search, therefore, for what's missing or invisible, or, as more truly, as Homi Bhabha suggests, of interrogating identity as a post-colonial prerogative. It becomes a challenge to the tradition of representation that conceives of identity as the satisfaction of a totalizing object of vision. For me, there would be no singular mode or even binary mode of identifying across these potential positionings, only instability, shifts, repositioning, loss, ambivalence, and movement. So in this sense, the movement of becoming rather than the being as fixed and stable attracted me. The idea of negotiating multiple regimes of disidentification, whereby the identities come to be seen as places of belonging. But much more broadly, I wanted to tackle that archetypal triad of Welsh identity: land, language, and lineage. I wanted to disturb some of the easy thinking about these and the given binaries that so easily mark out unbelonging. So Ulrika Perker, who I've mentioned in her writing about Sugar and Slate, argues that I put the Welsh presence into Black history and the Black presence into Welsh history. Well, I gave it a go. In terms of the Welsh presence in Black history, there are many familiar diaspora themes and departures that needed addressing. In particular, it was quite difficult for somebody in my position to map easily onto the conceptualization of Black Britain as it stood back then, the familiar trope of the Black urban community. So in describing this beyond the metropolis experience, we stretch out multicultural Britain, we extend its parameters and generate a much broader conceptualization of the Black British experience. There are lots of themes in Sugar and Slate common to diaspora writing, which I probably didn't consciously understand until I'm invited in times like this to think about my own work. So the sea, the ships, the boats, the crossing, the rewriting of histories, the revisiting of historical legacies that mark out relationships of power, connecting, disconnection, the myth of return, ambivalence to home, invisibilities and visibilities, and so on. This broad church of themes are easily labeled post-colonial theory. And one example of this, of course, is this myth of return. The book, Sugar and Slate, is about voyaging between Africa, Guyana, and Wales. And this imposed idea of return is part of that very negating influence in the struggle to be for Black Welsh identity and belonging. Its assumptions are part of the very denial and rendering invisible of my experiences as a Welsh woman. The equation of nation would be: to be Welsh is to be white and belong, to be Black is to be outsider, temporary visitor, stranger, time for your return. At the same time, to evoke this magical idea of return opens up the possibility of escape from all the cynicism of home. For some, return represents nostalgic recollections of a lost past. For others, a release from oppressive sets of circumstances. My own passages of return are characterized by ambivalence and contradiction, but also inevitability. And this fragmented identity is reflected in the structure of the book. Its fragmentation, the conversation between sections, the fact that it isn't a chronology, and that I use the construction of the book to show that doing and throwing. And also I imbue it with what Perker calls a rhizobiography of artifacts, scripts, letters, poems, bits of history that put the Black presence into Welsh history. There's no small amount of gender narrative in Sugar and Slate 2, as I use the eyes of my mother, Catherine Alice, and rework those ideas of the Welsh mum and her struggle being alone bringing up 5 Black girls in Wales. And it raises the question about the gendered nature of the writing of personal histories in the contemporary moment. We as 3 women. Finally, I wanted to say something about the critical intervention of performing the text in itself. Central to the idea of the Black literary tradition is the voice of deliverance, talking the book or speaking the book as a powerful metaphor of countering the deafening silence of the discourse of Western literary traditions, making the text speak, as Gates Jr. describes it. And of course, I didn't know a lot about this before I took Sugar and Slate out and started reading it in various national institutions across Wales, like the National Library and in venues in Cardiff, in my local gallery and so on. And I began to realise that this in itself is an appropriation of public spaces, places where we weren't supposed to be or hadn't been. Pitches, as John MacLeod calls it, of spatial creolisation, claiming a space, articulating a voice, and shifting the boundaries of cultural institutions. And so, to conclude, the intimate in history is indeed an interesting perspective. The appeal of the personal story in reaching new audiences becomes a subtle inscription on the nation and a relatable inscription on the nation. We have to ask, of course, is there a cost to this? The personal and the political, but also the political is personal. The ways in which global socioeconomic and racialized experience reverberate through intimate relationships. In Sugar and Slate, I peek through the slatted door of my parents sleeping in the afternoon, and I see them as, quote, 2 continents back to back. I talk about guns, gods, and Africans in our back kitchen in North Wales. My parents' discussion of Black and Welsh independence, of the colonial mind and how that shaped my father's work and his decisions, and how he needed to escape from the grip of Western thinking. And of course, I talk about the damage to my own thinking through a schooling that could not and did not acknowledge difference. And that, hint, hint, is why the curriculum is important to me today. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Charlotte. Applause are breaking out on the black tiles in front of me. That was magnificent, a sort of a testament and a testimony and a self-analysis. Yeah, great stuff. We're used to the pun of roots and roots. There was another one that came to mind listening to you of knots and knots, the negation of identity, but also the intertwining. Maybe we can discuss that later. And you were drawing out very powerfully as well the matrilineal dimension of the Welshness of the 3 speakers. It was also striking how much of what you said, I think, is also in some ways relevant to Hazel Carby's Imperial Intimacies as well. So without any more from me, let me pass the reins on to Hazel.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much, Charlotte. There are indeed so many resonances across our work. Can you see my screen? I have shared it.
Yep, that's fine.
Okay, great. So my mother was not among the people who used the terms English and British as if they were somehow synonymous. Integral to her sense of being British was actually her insistence on being Welsh. Being born in Wales was more significant than a childhood spent in the county of Somerset. My mother regaled my brother and I with tales of the heroic Owen Glendower, born in 1359, the last native Prince of Wales, how he raised a Welsh army in revolt against English domination and for years successfully fought the armies of the English king, Henry IV. My mother's stories focused on Glendower's triumphs. We had to discover the history of the defeat of the Welsh for ourselves. If as teenagers, my brother and I identified as Londoners, as children, we actually believed that we were being raised on the wrong side of the Welsh border. This refusal to be English did not compromise my mother's Britishness in the least. She retained vivid memories of everyone in her school and community participating in the annual celebrations of Empire Day on the 24th of May, occasions when even the most marginal members of small rural communities felt themselves connected to and part of a much larger colonial world. Empire Day celebrations were significant sites for producing multiple meanings of Britishness. Whatever my mother learnt about Britishness through this schooling formed the core of an ethical code and a basis for judgment, which, although never explicitly articulated as a coherent whole, punctuated her attempts to provide her offspring with guidelines for living. At the beginning of every summer, throughout their childhood, the girl and her brother were taken to Paddington Station and put on the Red Dragon in the care of a guard to travel on their own to Cardiff. Upon arrival, he delivered his charges to their relatives, touching the peak of his cap in farewell, signaled to the driver that all was well, and climbed aboard as the Red Dragon vented clouds of steam and with a loud snort and much chuffing and puffing, slowly pulled out of the station on its way to complete its journey at Carmarthen. Cardiff Canolog, while not as vast as Paddington, made the children feel small and vulnerable. Paddington was always crowded, but it was part of London, and they knew how to negotiate its terrain. Cardiff unsettled the girl. Their uncle carried suitcases, their aunt walked beside him. She grasped her brother's hand and followed in their wake, weaving her way through throngs of people as they left the platform and entered the concourse. Cardiff General was rebuilt in the 1930s. The girl did not yet know to name what she saw Art Deco when she slowed to gaze at a vaulted ceiling, hanging lights and walls with marble columns. Lingering forced her uncle to turn back and usher his charges across the concourse. Through an archway under the words, "The Great Western Railway," carved into the Portland stone, and out onto the square, where he nervously scanned a sea of automobiles to see where he had parked his Ford Anglia. The girl and her brother stood next to the gleaming, newly waxed car, waiting with their aunt while their uncle arranged the luggage in a spotlessly clean boot. When he lifted the front seat, they clambered into the spotlessly clean rear seat. The interior had been vacuumed and polished. It had a smell the girl could taste in the back of her throat. It was sharp, like sucking lemons. One of the first lessons the children would learn from their aunt and uncle was that dirt had been banished from their lives, that cleanliness, along with being neat and tidy, was essential to Methodist godliness. Dust must never be allowed to accumulate. This made the children extremely self-conscious, and they sat unnaturally still, peering out of sparklingly clean windows with hands clasped tightly in their laps so they did not stray and sully the polished surfaces with fingerprints. Their uncle was a methodical and sedate driver, which allowed the children time to adjust to the unfamiliar accents and rhythms of speech of uncle and aunt, and to the sights and sounds and smells of Wales. Leaving the train station behind, they passed railway lines on the left and crossed over the River Taff. Did either uncle or aunt mention that they were driving past the street where their grandmother was born? I forget. Canton, bordered by the River Taff, was a thriving agricultural community until it was transformed from 1850 onwards by the Great Western Railway and the expansion of Cardiff, which followed. Railway lines were laid across Canton Commons and a maintenance depot erected, which became the engineering base for the GWR in Wales, Canton's biggest employer. In 1883, there were no houses or streets between the railroad tracks and the Cowbridge Road, but within 5 years, fields were transformed into a dense cluster of working-class terraced Victorian houses, many of which were built by the Great Western Railway. The children's grandmother, Beatrice Williams, was born right here in 1888. As an infant, she lived and breathed in an environment and soundscape dominated by the maintenance depot. Her small body was assailed by smoke from burning coal, fumes from hot oil, the pungent sweat of men covered in grease, grit, and grime, the thunderous sounds of steel clashing against steel, the sonorous huffing and chuffing and high-pitched screeches, squeals, and whistles of steam locomotives. Stink, sounds, and soot produced inside and outside the gigantic sheds were expelled through funnels, flew from the tenders of steam trains, and filled the air and the nostrils of every living thing in Canton. Cardiff was the coal metropolis. Beatrice spent the first 8 years of life in a house next to this vast Great Western Railway junction, and not far from the docks to which the coal mined in the Rhondda Valley was transported for export. Her mother, the children's great-grandmother Rose, fought a constant battle against soot besmirching clothes, curtains, furniture, and flesh. Soot coats the surface of things, but also burrows into seams, penetrates the weave of fabric, and gathers in every corner and crevice. Its removal demanded constant vigilance. Rose would have spent many hours of labour washing, scrubbing, dusting, and sweeping to banish it, only to see it seep back in through windows and doorways. Coal dust colonises air. A war can be waged against filth visible on surfaces on what Rose could see, but the particulate matter and toxic chemicals, which were invisible to her, were inhaled and lay in wait in the lungs of her family to ambush them later. Is this where the family history of consumption began, with specks of coal dust and pieces of grit, with the inhalation of air polluted with particles? Is this where it began for all of them? For Beatrice, her mother Rose, and her sister Lillian Estella, who died in puberty? Pulmonary tuberculosis is caused by a bacterium, an airborne infection which is contagious, but scientists also believe that susceptibility to the disease is increased by ambient air pollution, and in particular by exposure to particulate matter. The constant presence of irritants and residue in the respiratory systems of Beatrice, Rose, and Stella would have increased their susceptibility to TB. Modernity and imperialism were celebrated and commemorated in the naming of the local streets. Some bore the name of British civil engineers and inventors associated with steam locomotion, but the street on which Beatrice lived celebrated an arch conservative, Lord Eldon, a Tory politician who twice held the position of Lord Chancellor and whose reactionary politics and policies included fierce opposition to the 1807 bill to end the slave trade. Eldon Street abutted and ran parallel to what had become a huge, complex network of rail tracks and junctions. Their house was directly opposite the gigantic engine shed, which serviced Cardiff's massive railway industry. The car headed northwest in the direction of Llantrisant, the village where the children knew their mother had been born. The girl adored the small Welsh village nestling at the foot of the Rhondda Valley. From late June to September, the girl and her brother lived in South Wales, absorbed into a large extended family that tried to mold them in their own image. The children's self-making was largely determined by their stubborn resistance to the mores their Welsh relatives attempted to instill. The girl gradually came to understand the significance of the Great Western Railway in the history of this branch of her mother's family. Generations of men, with the exception of her grandfather, had spent their working lives as engine cleaners, firemen, guards, porters and shunters, and one great uncle even drove an express train. Their employer was always referred to in reverent tones as the GWR. The young live in and fill the present, so it was often difficult for the children to locate themselves in tales of ancestors delivered in weighty tones and resonant with pedagogical and moral injunctions. And yet there was an insistence in the telling that these stories mattered for their future. Above all, they were instructed they must be responsible citizens if they were to attain security in life. If they worked diligently at school, they could attend a teaching college or even a university. But they must aim for a job which offered a lifetime of stability, security, and steady advancement. Achievement was the result of self-discipline, learning to persevere in the face of any difficulty or obstacle, being diligent in work habits and paying attention to detail. They were not to be unrealistic and challenge the barrier of class that prevented them from becoming lawyers or politicians. They should be careful not to overreach and to imagine that they could join the establishment, but they could aim to work in a bank, become a nurse, or a teacher in a state school. Above all, they were admonished to be respectable. Respectability was defined as keeping up appearances, cleanliness of body and mind, having respect for the self and for the hierarchies of class. It was important to obey those with greater social standing, for without a ladder of ascension, how could anyone climb and gain the respect of those below? Elders inserted themselves into a narrative of progress, like pieces into a national jigsaw puzzle, and its principles were instilled through this litany to the young. The children were led to understand that respectability in the Welsh families had been conferred by the GWR and the long-term security it offered, but this was misleading because the company did not confer respectability, but required it. In order to be considered for employment, the GWR demanded that all potential employees provide written testimony regarding prior conduct and standing in their community, testimony that they were upright, honest, and trustworthy. A prospective employee had to provide multiple written assurances in the form of references from clergymen, doctor, or teachers that he was already regarded as a respectable, upright, and responsible citizen. Beginning in 1837, the GWR administered a literacy test. all prospective employees had to write the following, and I quote, "Zealously try to excel. Industry is commendable. Perseverance deserves success. Quietude of mind is a treasure," end of quote. The act of writing these words recalled the council of Welsh aunts and uncles. The stories of individual achievement passed on during those long summers in Wales were actually verbatim accounts of the work discipline advocated by the GWR in employment handbooks, which were internalized and adopted as an individual work ethic. A commitment to a steady incremental rise upward to job security was the fruition of hard work and obedience and became the cornerstone of the Welsh family law. The girl understood that, like their Welsh cousins, she and her brother should abide by this work ethic and by this conception of one's place in the grand narrative of British modernization and class formation. But it was never just class that was at issue. For one's place in Wales was also determined by a taken for granted, not fully articulated story about white supremacy. The children knew that their Welsh relatives did not approve of the marriage of their parents. During World War II, not one of them had attended the wedding of one of their own to a Jamaican man, even though he was in the RAF. When their relatives composed family history, they took for granted that this also meant being rulers of an empire. Deeply embedded in memory are the numerous casual references to Black children in Cardiff as pickaninnies. As offspring of a white mother and a Black father, the children were awkwardly shaped, multifariously coloured pieces of the puzzle, and who knew how or where they would eventually fit into the nation. Being recognised as kin did not suffice to give an account of themselves. They were oddities because of their brown skin that their cousins thought could and should be washed off. One teenage cousin who pinched their arms whispered that they must know that they were sent to Wales because their parents despised them. This fear haunted the girl's brother, who would wake crying in the night. Despised was a word the girl added to her vocabulary. Sunday dinners were solemn and formal occasions which followed long hours at the Methodist chapel, most of which the girl spent in sullen resentment because she was not allowed to read. One Sunday, she shocked everyone at the table with an announcement that she intended to become a dancer. She might as well have stated that her ambition was to practice sex work. There was a collective intake of breath, followed by stunned silence, a tableau of frozen attitudes, mouths gaping, forks and napkins halfway to mouths. Upon each arrival in South Wales, the girl and her brother had to learn or relearn how to belong, to adjust to expectations of what sort of children they should be, to reimagine how to inhabit the pathways of sociality, landscape, and architecture, and to find their place in its design. As they grew older, the annual journeys no longer left them feeling bereft and needed to cling to one another in despair. To the girl, Cardiff was a bewildering, complex network of neighbourhoods, roads, railways, bridges, a river, and a castle. When I visit those villages now, the M4 motorway skirts the city. Driving at 70 miles an hour, I cannot see the circuitous route through busy urban streets, open fields, and small villages that the girl travelled with her brother in the back of her uncle's car. Thank you.
Thank you, Hazel. Again, the applause is breaking out here. Yeah, very, very moving. I'm not quite sure how to respond. The threads are complex, they intertwine, but also the narratives are also simultaneously very, very clear. Charlotte made the distinction between the I and the question of perspective, and a book like Imperial Intimacies opens itself to multiple perspectives. I've been watching some of the discussions in the press in Britain, and American responses, which are interestingly different, I think, sometimes in the response to the Welsh dimension of the narrative as well. And to place it within a Welsh context exposes some aspects, such as that emphasis on cleanliness and dust. We spoke last week about the construction of a pure and docile Wales in the Victorian era, the Welsh reconstructing themselves as Britons rather than sort of primitive, dirty backwoodsmen. And that Cymru Lan, Cymru Lonydd, that sort of pure and peaceful Wales, was also Cymru Wen, a white Wales. And the legacy of that construction, I think, is present in your narrative in certain ways. So thank you very much. And yeah, the lines of connection between the two speakers are very clear, I'm sure. The point about the lack of approval for the marriage of the parents links to Branwen, who's searching for Taid, is very much a meditation on that process to some extent. Her Carnarvon Constable grandfather not accepting the marriage of his daughter at all. So Branwen, let me pass the reins on to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's fantastic to hear Charlotte and Hazel telling their stories. And of course, you know, my story is also their story. So I feel as if there's some things I don't really have to say anymore, but I want to talk from my perspective as a filmmaker, because I think that's what I can contribute to this conversation. Storytelling is my kind of line of work, whether it's documentary or fiction. It's all about telling stories, and it's all about choosing what is salient, what's important, what gets kept and what gets left behind. And that process of creating a narrative or coherent story world that an audience can enter and follow kind of restricts you and makes you make choices and makes you, of course, leave a lot of things out. Daniel was saying in the introduction that I made a film about Christa Wolf, who's an East German writer, novelist, who, after the fall of the wall, her country disappeared completely, and kind of like Atlantis just sunk into oblivion. And she wrote a book about Medea, and when I talked to her about it, I asked her, you know, are you telling your own story? And she said, yes, of course, I'm telling my own story. And what I notice about storytelling is that every time you tell the story, you erase your story at the same time, because the one that is told stands in the place, blocks the space of all the other stories that you could have told or other people could have told. So every decision you make about what you're going to tell about yourself is a decision to erase yourself in a certain extent, and then have this representative of your existence remain. So when I think about Searching for Taid, which I made in 1997 with Colin Thomas, who Welsh people will know as a very important filmmaker, documentarian from Cardiff, whose series The Dragon Has Two Tongues very much influenced my childhood. And that idea of the dragon having two tongues kind of like was something I used to sort of identify with, like the duality of Welshness and the fact that Welshness can be two, and that it can be, I think in his case, he was talking about two political points of view or two different ideological ways of looking at Welsh history. But for me, it was like, oh, you don't have to speak Welsh to be Welsh, for example, you can have a different tongue. And then the idea of being Welsh and Nigerian, but still being Welsh, it kind of made, you know, Wales seem like a place that was not a monocultural force at all, you know. And of course, my mother, as a Welsh nationalist who, you know, for whom Wales is the most important thing, you know, every time she watches television till today, the only thing she says at the end of the day is, why don't they ever mention Wales? Because that's all that matters in the sense of who she is. And my father, on the other hand, whose Urobo identity was so important to him and his language. And so these two nationalists from small ethnicities who had been invaded by the English, you know, and had that in common, were so much steeped in their own identities that my brother and I were like, you know, okay, we're half this and we're half that, but what are we and where do we belong? And I think our job was to construct a whole new identity that would create a space for them to be together. And I don't know, it's difficult for me to express it, but I made a little film. It's not a film, it's just bits and pieces of fragments of our history. My father died last year, so I was trying to help my parents, you know, organize papers and tidy things up. And in that process, I found hundreds of notebooks that my mother had kept over the years. And, you know, they are history books, and they are, you know, those are stories that maybe filmmakers would never choose to make films about, but they say it all. And I just put together, and I hope I can share my screen and show you this. It's just 2 minutes. It's just a note that she wrote. Okay, I hope this works. Are you seeing a kind of a screen that looks like a film with a piece of paper?
Yeah, it works.
An incident, Sunday, 15th April, 1973. I was preparing breakfast in the kitchen and began to wonder about the means for this week's meals. I remembered that David had said the green peppers he was growing were doing well after being watered, and thought of stuffed peppers. So I walked into the sitting dining room for the last item of breakfast and said, "Will there be any nice big green peppers ready this week?" "Why don't you go and have a look?" was the cutting remark. I really felt fed up. Why try? I thought this meal represented some kind of joint venture. And people normally like to talk about the contribution they can make from something they know done. But my expectations were all at sea. Was this a cultural difference, in that you just take what you like from growing things with no reference to the planter? Or is it individual? My mother would never have harvested anything from our garden without reference to Bob. And he would always be interested in the ultimate fruits of his labor, the meal. Just as I was churning every point in my mind, Branwen began to cry. She was on the floor with Adora, and she had been talking about her house. She wanted Adora to play with her. She started to complain, but he wouldn't play. I asked her what she wanted him to do. She said, "Be daddy." I said, "But what is he supposed to do to be daddy?" She said, "Read," in the most of course tone. I burst out laughing. Here was I wanting my husband to be different and stop reading and just taking his breakfast with no contribution on his part, and be more dynamic. Manage the garden, produce plenty of crops, talk about them, discuss the dishes that we might get from them, etc. And to Branwen, this reading, uncommunicating person was the essence of what daddy ought to be. It's all a matter of expectations and experience.
Okay. So it's a note she wrote in 1973. She had just got married. And it's, to me, it's like the next chapter or the next thing that would happen in Searching for Taid, because Searching for Taid is about how my mom met my dad and wanted to marry him, and how my grandfather, who was the chief constable of the North Wales Constabulary, had a problem to accept the idea of his daughter marrying a Black man, even though he was a PhD and he was, you know, accomplishing, you know, the kind of things that he would respect. The fact of his identity, his cultural identity, but also the fact of his, the connotation, you know, that society had constructed. And I think that's one of the reasons why I sometimes I kind of have a different relationship to that film from how I used to feel about it. I think, and that's another thing that happens, is that history is not set in stone. It's always changing. Your relationship to it. Raoul Peck has this new film out, which I think is going to be a game changer in filmmaking and in the way we see history, called Exterminate All the Brutes. And in it, his narrator says, the past has a future that no one is expecting. And the past is just a place we go to refer to our present. And when I go to that past now, I have more empathy with my Taid, because I understand him in a different way. And I also feel as if I inherited the conflict that my parents, that was the basis almost, or part of the basis of their relationship, was this rebellion and was this resistance and was this decision in the 1960s to break out of, which was popular then, to break out of the rules and to marry each other regardless of acceptance on either side, and to forge forward and to create because of love. But we are the children of those decision makers. We are the ones who had to grow up and navigate this thing of being neither this nor that Charlotte was talking about. And this idea of having to embrace it and having to find a freedom in it and having to find a way to use it, in my case, as a filmmaker, to say, okay, the camera and I have something in common because we're both pretending we're not here, or we both are standing outside and looking in, and maybe that gives us sight or whatever, but it is an uncertain place to be. So when Taid had the reticence he had, steeped in the traditions that he was steeped in, yes, we're angry that he didn't embrace it, but at the same time, now, at least at this age now, I kind of have more empathy. And I find it also interesting because this was a story my parents had told us, that this is how their marriage was embraced or not embraced. But when they saw the film, they also said, well, that's not quite how it was. So the idea of wanting to render accurately what happened, even to yourself, is not even possible. So what I'm doing now with my films, and this Chibok Girls film that Daniel talked about, is that I'm really trying to make audience know that this is what I think I know about what happened now, but it's only a shadow. It's only a gesture. It shouldn't have more significance than that, because things are always changing. The past is always changing. The present is always changing. Everything is in motion. And then so what remains? Okay, for me, my name is Branwen. And it's funny, you know, having that name is something very strong, is something very solid in terms of identity, because when I go to Wales, no matter what people think when they look at me, when I tell them my name is Branwen, there's authority in that name. When they have to call me Branwen, they have to recognize I am Branwen. You know, they have to know that I am Branwen, that a Branwen is me, you know? And so that, my mother's gesture to give me that name, or my surname, Okpako, which it was my grandfather's name. He didn't have a surname. In those days, they didn't have names and surnames in Urobo land, where my my father grew up. But when he went to school and he had to embrace Christianity and I had to take a Christian name, he chose David. And they said, okay, what's your surname? And he said, I don't have a surname. I chose David. They said, okay, what's your father's name? He said, my father's name is Okpako. So my surname is my grandfather's first name. So that tells me who I am. It also tells me where I come from. And my mother's story, she might be here in the participating from Nigeria now. I hope she is. When I used to ask her, why did you call me Branwen? She said, because Branwen means white raven. And so you are the black child of a white bird. So I named you after the white child of a black bird. So I thought of myself as being, I'm a white raven, or I'm a bird that has a different color from the other birds, but I'm still one of the birds, kind of thing, It was only later that I began to understand the story of Branwen and what actually happened to her and how tragic her story is and how painful her story is and how she was also a foreigner in a foreign land in Ireland and never really belonged. So there's that layer as well, which, I'm not necessarily wanting to fully identify with. So I think, this idea of being Black or even this way that European countries are embracing their Black nationals now is a new way of, we're all three of us are old enough to know, to talk about when it wasn't embraced and now it is being embraced. But it's all a way of defining the nation. Wales is going to define itself now through us and through our presence and they're going to modernize themselves by saying we have Black Welsh people as well. So we're playing our role, but at the same time, we need to think about these things, the idea of history, about whether or not, what is an identity? Is it a language? Is it a people? Is it the land? What is it to belong? Why did I make a film about my Taid? I made a film about my Taid because I wanted to tell the world that these people are my ancestors. I wanted to claim my ancestors and access their power, my ancestral power. Why do I know about that idea? Because of my Nigerian side, because of my Orobo side, because of my father's adherence to traditional religion, where people worship their own ancestors. So whether your ancestor wants to accept you or not, it doesn't matter. They're still your ancestor and they belong to you. The way they behaved, whether they were polite or impolite, actually, it doesn't matter. They are our ancestors. They're ours. They belong to us. And where they are, they're supporting us, because we're their descendants. So this whole thing of identity, this whole thing of storytelling, this whole thing of history making, I see it as a search for a loving and respectful acceptance of ourselves and each other. I think that's what all three of us are talking about. We are asserting our claiming our place, obviously, because we have to assert ourselves and say, we're here and we're part of this story. We have to respect our ancestors because they're ours. So we have to respect ourselves. And we have to be aware that this is a story we're telling now, and tomorrow we'll tell another story and another story. So we can't identify with it too much, because it's also just a shadow, so yeah, these are my thoughts on this topic right now. Everything else has been so well said by others that I just put mine like that.
Thank you, Branwen. That's, well, again, just a very, very powerful paper. What Branwen does, of course, is sends messages back to Wales carried by Drydwy Branwen, her starling. So I wonder whether that's a sort of allegory for your films. Well, in a way, what I'd like to do is kind of facilitate a discussion between you rather than generate questions of my own. as I'm a sort of literary critic amongst historians in Llafur, let me suggest that literature and culture, filmmaking, it's kind of significant that your works exploring these dimensions of your identities have departed from empirical historical analysis in a sense. That idea of erasure you were talking about, Branwen, Derrida has a line in Archive Fever where he says something like, disappearing cultures don't leave an archive. There are things that you can't find. If you're looking for the death of a language, you won't find it. People don't tend to talk about it. What do you look at? And you move to literature, to other forms of expression, forms of hybridity, of identities merging. How do you find that in the empirical record? I think Hazel's book explores that in particular because you're in the archive. There's a scene I remember where you're drinking coffee in the archive, and you're almost suggesting there's only so much I can find out. So I wonder whether the three of you might talk about that a little bit. The forms that you've used to express what you've been talking about. Maybe Hazel, you begin because you're next to me on the screen here, and then Charlotte and Branwen to respond.
So we may not be conventional historians, but if you think about it, all three of us have talked about history. And I found myself nodding all the time listening to Branwen and Charlotte, because when Charlotte is talking about us in relation to history, it's also because we are, and in relation to the question of life stories, we are finding, it seems to me, unconventional ways of bringing ourselves into being through narrative as historical subjects. And all three of us are exploring unconventional ways of doing that, because the conventional narratives have left us out. The conventional narratives, we've either been, total absences and erased, or marginalized as other, for example. And it seems that we're all reaching for new languages, whether they're sort of a more literary languages or whether they're cinematic languages, to address that question of being historical subjects. And all of us, it seems to me, are thinking about the multiplicity of those selves and possibilities. Whether Branwen is saying there isn't just one history, right? It's completely in flux. I think you see that in all of our works, and I have multiple selves in Imperial Intimacies, and Charlotte has multiple voices and moments, and all of us are always taking very seriously that question of movement, of being in flux, of possibility, and of refusing to account, in quote, account for ourselves in relation to what is being demanded of us, actually. We're finding other ways to give alternative accounts of those lives.
Thank you, Hazel. Yeah.
I hope you would, I hope you sort of share that, because I was, as you were talking, I was saying yes.
Totally.
Charlotte, do you want to come in, or Branwen?
Yeah, I think that's really well sort of summed it up. One kind of dimension of it that I was thinking about was the reach of this personal story. And I think I mentioned in my talk about it being relatable, and it speaks in a way to everybody somehow. And the reach of that story, it's not like, oh, I'm going to read a history book, or I'm going to look at a film about Welsh history or something like that. I'm reading this story, or I'm watching Branwen's film, or reading Hazel's story. And the reach of those stories is huge and important. And I remember when, you know, it's years ago when I wrote Sugar and Slate, I remember thinking, my mother-in-law will read this and my neighbour will read it. And, you know, the lady down the road might read it too. And it was that kind of sense that you're using this vehicle to communicate, you know, that complexity that we just described about identities and history and fluidity, but you're just making it kind of accessible to, you know, a wide range of people. And that, to me, I think made it worth it, because I asked in my paper, is there a cost to this? And when I see Branwen's 2-minute film, the huge emotional resonance and the effective elements of that film in touching me and in Branwen giving it to us. And when I see Hazel's pictures of her little girl's self, so much is given by Black authors in this way, and you just begin to wonder about the cost of the burden, or another burden. You know, you'll think of a better word, I'm sure. But that's a thought that comes to me about what is the cost of that. And I remember when I was writing Sugar and Slate, the Planet asked me, did I want to put some pictures, photographs and pictures in, and I didn't want to. I wasn't really prepared to give that much in the way that I see Hazel and Branwen have given of themselves. And I was very interested to hear from them just about that. What's the cost of that?
Well, it's really interesting that you should, two things spring to mind when you're talking. One is that with film, I'm sure you as writers probably have this too. It just looks to me as if, as a writer, you've got kind of more, you can do more, you can go in different directions, you can put more stuff in, you can write a really big book where everything's in there. But with film, it's temporal. You've got to stick to time, and you've got to create your story world. You've got to create your universe and tell a story at the same time. So if you do anything that is the audience is not used to, if you tell a story in a different way, you can lose them from the story itself. So if you're negotiating with technology, with technology, I mean, language is anyway a technology, you know, and a novel is also a technology, and a book is a piece of technology as well. So I'm sure you feel confined even by words, but I feel very confined by narrative. I feel confined by image and composition, and having to have a conflict and having to bring everything to a point, you know. So Searching for Taid, for me, when I look at it now, it's like you had to tell the story of all that and bring it down to the wedding, you know. And it's like you had to do that. You had no choice. But there's so much more to it than that. And now that that's what there is, it's like you kind of blocked everything else. And same thing with this, with the pictures, you know. When I read Sugar and Slate, I had my own pictures in my mind, and I saw my own people. And you didn't put pictures, but by not putting pictures, I put my pictures. When you put pictures, though, it's also a type of words. Because the picture is no longer your picture. It becomes a sign, a signifier. It becomes that thing. It's representing that thing. So when I see Hazel's pictures, you know, they are the pictures of us. And so then you start thinking, you've always been the only one, and you've always been unique and different from everybody else. And differentness has been something that you didn't like, and you wanted to fit in, and you wanted to be the same. You know, I grew up in Nigeria, and I also wanted to be the same color as everybody else. It really doesn't have anything to do with which color it is. It's just that you want to be the same as everybody else, or whatever that everybody else is, you want to be like it. So that was my experience. So you want to dissolve into everything. But then on the other hand, when you really start becoming a story, and you start becoming a symbolic a signifier that's recognizable to everybody as that thing, and it flattens and becomes two-dimensional, and then they say, no, that's not me, that's not me, that's not me. You know what I mean? So you're in this struggle between making yourself visible enough to be seen, but then as soon as you're seen, you disappear. You disappear. Because all that's left is the thing, is the outline. Being invisible, like, you know, what Daniel was saying about looking for a language that's disappeared with no archive, that one is probably going to last longer. Don't forget, Welsh still is spoken, but Latin is dead. The more the things exist, the more it disappears. The more it doesn't exist, the more it sustains.
There's some hope there, Branwen. The one question that's come in relates to Hector's internal colonialism. I think, Charlotte, you used the phrase seemingly approvingly. I mean, it's a highly contentious phrase in Welsh historiography. As you know, Andrew Chandler's asking, is it a phrase we still use? Any responses to that?
You'll have to answer that, or the historians will have to answer that fully, but I certainly use it as a springboard for that idea that, you know, somehow Wales is immune because it's had this experience in the past of colonial, you know, exploitation of its culture and its language and its territory and so on. So it's just a quick concept that suggests that. But of course, in the book, you make it much more complex than that. You know, the twists and turns of it. And I know that you know, I'm not a historian, but I certainly know that there'll be a lot who will argue about the two-way process. There'll be a lot who will argue about Welsh involvement in colonialism and so on and so forth. But it's nevertheless a snappy concept that allows you even to dispute it. So it'd be interesting to hear what the historians have to say. But yes, I know that it's contentious.
Yeah, Hector's book is interesting in relation to our discussion in that, I mean, he was an American sociologist who'd never been to Britain at all when he wrote the book. And it's based on statistics, but he writes in his introduction that his reason for writing it was to try and understand the tension between assimilationism and nationalism in the African-American movement, you know, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X in shorthand, and to try and find a place where he could trace this historically over a long period of time. And the response from Labour historians in Wales in particular tended to be, oh, he's bringing these highfalutin identity, ethnicity ideas from America to a context that where they don't pertain. Whereas in literary criticism and cultural criticism, I think Hector's been influential, not least the idea of internality, you know, that idea of the melancholia of race is Anne Anlin Cheng's idea, you know, that in the process of assimilation, it's the stories you leave behind that you've been talking about. And the response to that leaving behind is a kind of grief, is a kind of internality of things. You know, there's a public face, if you like, and then an inner self. Any thoughts on that? Does that reflect something about possible imperial intimacies, Hazel, or your work, Branwen? You know, the layers of the self, public selves, private selves.
What it makes me think about, and is the reason why I picked that little piece from my mother's note, because I think that what she had to leave behind was her identity before marriage, and then and we haven't talked about, I mean, of course we're talking about gender, but that fact that you had to now become a wife, and you had to now be the one who's in charge of the kitchen, and you had to be the one that's, you know, has to do, and you can't be friends anymore and work out these things together anymore. I think that is an experience that could have happened to any woman who got married after the first 3 or 4 years of marriage, this awakening to realize that, oh, you know, this is my domain and that's your domain and this is how it has to be. So I think that's when she surrendered or left behind in Wales her identity as a person rather than a woman or a wife.
Right. Hazel, any
Yeah,
thoughts?
I think these, you know, in relation to the question of identities, I'm always sort of navigating my way through questions that, for example, that Stuart Hall asked, that identities aren't somehow fixed to be in the past to be discovered, but are always in the future to be remade. So I trace a lot of the sort of becoming of people, both in terms of how they are inscribed, to adopt imperial or colonial identities, but also how they start to imagine themselves as white, for example. I mean, and it's the question of gender is really important to me, and the world of women is there throughout the book, because the stories that I inherited, some of which I mentioned today, were about men, a lot of them. And so kitchens are really important places, and bedrooms are really important places in my book. And so, but on the other hand, I don't use these binaries, because I think binaries have put ourselves into the position in conventional histories of somehow thinking, well, there's the metropole and the colony, there's the inside and there's the outside. And I try to actually, break those down. One of the, what is passed on, for example, in terms of memory, is, as Branwen said, actually not always what happened. I mean, I was outlining these stories of endless progress, right, of being respectable, but what I discovered in writing this book was extraordinary poverty, all of which was buried. None of those stories were passed on. The fact that my great-grandmother actually died in a Bristol workhouse, nobody talked about that. So part of the cost is also investigating why do people feel that it's these stories that have to be passed on to the children, and with a sort of pedagogical intent about how they should live in the future. Whereas actually what I was finding was extraordinary poverty that was existing side by side with the sense that somehow, even however poor you were somehow superior, to people in the colonies. So I'm always trying to deal with those contradictions, not as fixed, but as being continually worked through and lived in all sorts of contradictory ways. And the contradictory, just to go back to an earlier point, is also in terms of the cost of writing. I mean, when you mentioned that moment of sitting in the archives drinking coffee, that was also a moment where, like Branwen, I tried to stop time. I think how you tell stories has everything to do with the temporality. And so there are moments in the book where I really tried to pause and dwell, because that moment when I'm drinking coffee and looking out of the windows of the National Archives at Kew, this sort of like rebellious group that always used to sneak out there to smoke cigarettes, and I always sort of like admired. I couldn't imagine why they didn't have umbrellas up, because I thought it was raining. But actually, it was the tears flooding down my eyes because of what I'd found in the archives. And I try to sort of encompass the fact that discovering these stories and then trying to figure out how to retell them can actually be sometimes very painful to think about and to narrate.
Oh, that's very powerfully articulated, Hazel, and links. We could carry on, couldn't we, for a long time yet, but I see that time is running out. Ian's reappeared, and I think he's going to close proceedings. So before he does that, let me just thank the three of you. Always Lord Calon, from the bottom of my heart, for a really, illuminating the whole conversation. I'm glad it was recorded. This will be used for teaching in the semesters ahead, I'm sure, and I hope it's not the beginning of a conversation, but I hope it's not the end of a conversation, but the beginning of a conversation that will evolve over the years ahead. So back to you, Ian.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Daniel. Thanks very much. That was magnificent. On behalf of everyone, I'd like to extend grateful thanks for chairing, Daniel, and to Hazel, Charlotte and Branwen for offering us such a range of powerful and moving personal perspectives on empire and identity and their relationship to Wales. Many thanks also to you, the audience, for your comments and questions via chat. Grateful thanks also to the extremely hardworking members of Llafur Subcommittee, James, Sean, Darren, Mowena, and Matthew for their help in organising and publicising this, and indeed all of Llafur's recent online events. Also thanks to Neil Evans, Bill Jones, Marion Gwynn, Colin Thomas, Paul O'Leary for their helpful advice and suggestions. Above all, thanks very much to our events secretary, James Phillips, who's invested a tremendous amount of time and energy into organising this series. Thanks very much, James. Excellent stuff. As I said at the start, today's session marks the end of our Llafur Spring Series on migration and Wales. We'll be taking a short break over the next few weeks, but already have some exciting ideas for events later in the year in the pipeline. So look out for these being advertised on the Llafur website, Facebook page, and Twitter feed. Llafur members should also receive details of up-and-coming events via email in due course. The first of these will be a lecture by Laura Forster to mark the 150th anniversary of the Paris Commune, which will take place on Thursday, 27th of May at 7 p.m. Again, via Zoom, full details to follow. If it can just be permitted, one last membership plug. Our website includes a membership sign-up facility, a mere £15 to join, £10 for unwaged. So if you're not yet a member yet, please do consider joining. Our website also contains recordings of all our online events going back to last summer, when we first embarked on this new and exciting direction of travel in the history of Llafur. They're really worth a listen. Thank you. It only remains for me to say thank you once again for your support, and we look forward to welcoming you back to more Llafur online events in the near future. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much. Thank you.